I found a strange piece of ore on the mountain, but when I held it in my hand, I discovered that it seemed to have a life of its own and could change shape. What was even more frightening was that the temperature of the ore was 37 degrees Celsius, which was the same as the human body temperature. I instantly realized that I might strike it rich, because this was the first time I had ever seen such a magical piece of ore. I was sure that it must be very valuable. To verify my guess, I quickly took a few photos of the rock and sent them to an expert appraiser to estimate its value. But just then, my father suddenly called and gave me some sad news. It turned out that my sister had late-stage cancer, and my father, who couldn't afford the treatment, had decided to give up. After hearing this, I quickly asked my father to wait a little longer. As long as I sold the rock I had just found, I would have the money. I then rushed to the airport with the mineral, intending to return home to help my sister with her treatment. Little did I know that halfway there, I encountered a life-threatening crisis. As the plane approached a snow-covered mountain, the pilot suddenly noticed a flock of birds blocking the path ahead. With no other option, the pilot tried to avoid the birds, but what we never expected was that the flock of birds actually attacked the plane. This caused the plane's warning lights to come on instantly, and the plane lost control completely at that moment. As the plane plummeted toward the ground, the pilot could only grip the steering wheel tightly to minimize any impact upon landing. The next second, the plane collided with the snow-covered mountain. Fortunately, when I woke up, I only had some superficial injuries. Unfortunately, the pilot's abdomen had been cut open by something. To survive, I quickly exited the cabin and shouted for help, but after shouting for a long time, I received no response. I had no choice but to return to the cabin and use the intercom to call for help. However, there was no response over the intercom either. With no other options, I took out the compass and map to determine our approximate location. However, the nearest highway was 50 kilometers away. I was instantly overcome with despair. It was the middle of winter, and if I tried to escape with the injured pilot, we would both certainly die. So I took a box from the plane and set it on fire with a lighter, hoping to attract attention. But in this desolate snowy mountain wilderness, there was no one living in this area. It was clear that the crash site was an uninhabited wilderness. What made me even more despairing was that, by the next day, the pilot had completely died, with no signs of life. As the howls of wolves echoed around us, I immediately realized we couldn't stay here any longer. To survive, I had to take matters into my own hands, so I quickly gathered usable supplies from the plane. I found a handgun next to the pilot. With the handgun, I no longer felt afraid. Now, if I just kept walking south for 50 kilometers, I could reach a transportation highway. That way, I would definitely be rescued. But just as I was about to leave, I suddenly heard a radio transmission coming from inside the plane. I quickly returned to the cockpit and discovered that the sound was coming from the captain's portable radio. I wanted to use the radio to call for help, but the next second, the radio suddenly ran out of power. Fortunately, I knew where the plane's backup power source was, so I charged the walkie-talkie using the plane's power. Looking at the strange mineral I had found, I was certain that selling it would save my sister's life. An hour later, realizing the battery was almost fully charged, I quickly switched the walkie-talkie to the distress channel and frantically shouted out distress signals. But the next second, there was actually a voice coming from the walkie-talkie. Unfortunately, it wasn't a rescue team, but a pilot who had also crashed about 20 kilometers away. John said his plane had crashed near a lake, and his leg was stuck under the seat, so he hoped I could come and rescue him, since there was no one else around. When I learned that John's location was only 20 kilometers away, and that fixing his radio would allow him to call for rescue, I decided to head north toward where John was. In this desolate place, finding someone was the only way to survive. However, I overlooked one thing, which was that two planes crashing in the same uninhabited area was simply too much of a coincidence.